Hello, fellow writers, and welcome back to Writing in Progress. John and Justin here. We're so excited to have you back, coming off the heels of our most successful episode ever. It actually, just looking at the stats recently, passed Imposter, our live outline from a few years ago.
Nice.
Yes. The Whippy Awards have 117 downloads, having only been up about a week, and we didn't push it on social media at all. We just posted it to some forums, and we posted it on the podcast networks. We didn't make any posts on Instagram or Facebook or anything like that. There's a reason we didn't, which I want to address real quick. We're a growing podcast. We jokingly call ourselves Wipper Snappers because we're kind of figuring this out as we go. And most of our episodes that we've uploaded usually get 10 to 20 downloads in the first week. This last one we did had over 100. And I think we learned some things this round. We did something different. We took a risk. We shared some other people's stories. And we learned some people that we shared it with offered some criticism, which was valid criticism of we probably should have asked permission first. Even though we weren't sharing anything more than titles and brief synopsis, just common courtesy, we should have reached out to those authors just to make sure, hey, is it okay if we talk about your work on our podcast? And we got so excited, and other people were so excited for our Whippy Awards that we kind of got swept up and didn't take the time to do that, and we should have. Luckily, we've appeared to have kind of dodged a bullet. Most of the authors, I think now we've heard from, 18 of the 23 who we mentioned, and all 18 were extremely positive about it, very excited. And in fact, I'm going to be reading some of the messages at the community kind of spotlight here at the end. But we did want to take a second just to point out that we kind of messed up. We learned we're going to do better if we choose to share other people's works, even our own opinions about it. In the future, it's something we should definitely talk to the authors first.
And our opinions were nothing but positive, and some of the responses were just awesomely positive back, and we appreciate that. We're trying to put nothing but good vibes out. Exactly. So our intentions were good.
Yes,
our intentions were good.
Exactly, and I think everyone acknowledged that, and it's just still sometimes good intentions could go wrong. What some of the hang up is. The stories were posted to a forum that is technically private. You have to pay to be in the competition to be in that forum. In my mind, if you share something to, a forum that 700 people have access to, or when we could do NYC Midnight, it's thousands of people. The miscalculation I made, the error in my logic was, well, they must be okay with people talking about their story if they've shared it to such a public forum. Even though it's not technically a public forum, it's a forum that a large amount of people have access to. And that was wrong. I messed up, and we owned up to it on the forums. We apologized, and it's definitely, like I said, we're growing, we're learning, and we'll do better next time. So we just wanted to address that right off the bat in case anyone's listening and saw some of the discussion on the forums. We wanted to make sure we addressed that. And if you were wondering why we didn't push it on social media, we kind of got a little gun shy. Even though we were really excited about the episode, didn't want to push something that could potentially upset someone. So we kind of drew back, and we made it known to any of the authors, if any of them have a change of heart and they don't want that episode up, we're willing to take it down. So if one day that episode goes missing, it means an author reached out to us, but I don't anticipate that's going to happen. So anyways, moving on from that, we're turning the page from Writing Battle. We had a great experience with that. I'm sure we will do more Writing Battle stuff in the future, and I know a lot of people listening are here because of Writing Battle. So we're definitely looking forward to dive into that again someday, but we're going to take a break and talk about craft, an ongoing thing we've been doing. Way back a few years ago, John and I identified 8 elements of a story, and we had a little debate and ranked them in order of what we thought was most important. And one of those elements was voice. And so we've kind of had this ongoing series where we dive deeper into each of these elements and kind of give our own opinions on it and maybe some advice. we called it a how-to series, really because we thought that'd be something that, an aspiring author might click on. I do feel like as I've gotten more involved in the writing community and kind of moved further along the Dunning-Kruger line, I feel really awkward making a how-to video when I know some of the people listening have much stronger writing voices than I have. So I don't know if how-to is necessarily the right way. We're going to stick with that because it's what the series has been. But we're just going to have a discussion about voice. We're going to talk about writing voice, what it is, how we approach it, what we've learned about it. And if you're listening and you're like, man, these two dopes are totally missing the point, they should have talked about this, email us. We're at writinginprogresspod@gmail.com. We'd love to have people join in the conversation. So, but before we get into voice, we've been trying to start each episode with just some quick updates into our own journey. That's kind of how this whole podcast got started, two teachers talking about their journey. So I'm going to turn the mic over to John here. And John, what have you been up to in the last couple weeks since we last talked on the pod?
Well, I had an awesome dinner on Wednesday night with two missionaries. And the guy used to be a teacher at Columbus Academy and literally sold everything and moved to Kenya, Africa, to work at a missionary school there. And then he started something called Kenya Kids Can. And basically he, through the school system, helps feed students who don't have enough food to eat. And it was so inspiring, so awesome. And we're both teachers, not only are we writers, but we're both teachers. And I was able to share with him how a girl who I'd kind of been championing all year, and in my class, you have to earn things. And I tell every beginning of the year, I say every year there's some student who starts out as not maybe one of my top students, but by the end of the year, she is, number one. She maybe has the highest percentage in all my classes combined. And this quarter, this Latino student, she just outworked everyone, and nice. She was number one. And I shared that with him, and then he goes, I got a story for you. In our where we work, there's a Maasai culture, and many of the girls, when they hit 8th grade, they are married off. It's an arranged marriage, and this one girl did not want to be married off, and she was an excellent student. And so we negotiated with her father and said, she's an excellent student. She'd love to go to one of these national schools that you go live there. And she didn't have the clothes for the school. So they paid the fees for the school. They paid the dad kind of the dowry. And then she went to the school. Anyway, he's like, they rank all of their students. There's 215. She's the only Maasai girl there. She's the only one. She's number one. Wow. Out of 215. She's number one. So I was like so fired up. We were sharing these stories. And although we're writers, we're also teachers. And I was just like, this is so awesome to impact lives. That's just really important to me. I've been watching a lot of basketball. Another thing, I've really been inspired by you and some people in Writing Battle and some other people. During COVID, I wrote some essays. They haven't been published or anything. I'm currently putting those essays together for a possible book. I've identified a possible theme. Now I got the hard work of editing, throwing out essays I really like that don't fit that theme, kind of develop a calendar and some self deadlines. Shout out to former guest Randy Spears. I said, hey, man, I got this manuscript. I love it so much. I think it can be published. And he said, quit treating your writing like gold and go mine more gold. And I really like that quote. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to go mine some more gold. I'm going to set that manuscript aside for right now, and I'm going to go mine some more gold. So I've been working hard since January 1st. I've been writing almost every day and really getting after it. So the folks, that listen to this podcast, and you, Justin, you guys have inspired me, and I appreciate that. And I think community is important for that. So what about you? What you been up to? What you been doing besides two little kids?
Yeah. So as far as writing goes, not a whole lot of progress. I'm going to talk about a little bit that I did make, but yeah, dad life is front and center right now. The other day, my 2-year-old threw a truck through our television set. He wasn't acting out. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He was literally just playing real nice with his truck. everything was fine. And then the next thing I knew, I heard a bang, and I looked up, and half of our TV was black, and big old crack in the middle. Like he must have just decided he wanted to throw the truck, and he threw the truck, and it went in the TV. So, yeah. And our 6-month-old is teething, and we just transitioned rooms. So that was actually what I was working on most of the weekend, was cleaning up a room that was going to be Mac's room, but for the last 6 months has just turned into the room where we put all the junk in our house. So that was a pretty big project of moving everything around, and it feels good to have that accomplished. Teacher life, third quarter grades are in, so I was struggling with that. My class is a semester class, and the first half of it is a lot more grade intensive on my part. There's a lot more stuff, little things to grade. And I got all those done, which is a good feeling. That was stressing me out.
That is a good feeling.
Yeah. Coaching life, March is the most stressful time for me as a coach. Indoor overlaps with outdoor for a few weeks. Indoor is now officially done. And the beginning of season for track is always so stressful. I oversee a program of over 150 kids. And it's just all the administrative stuff. It's picture day. It's uniforms, ordering all those. It's early season roster paperwork and kind of communication and fundraisers and all that crap. And I
feel like through you, I've learned so much about this sport that I had no idea about. Like, there's so much, it's data driven. There's so much organization.
Oh, yeah.
I thought track was run fast, turn left.
Yeah.
But that is clearly not the case.
Yeah.
I've just seen you work and work and work at this and grow our program. And kudos to you for that.
Oh, thanks.
We have a state ranked program, and it's amazing.
Yeah, it's like anything in education. It's what you put into it. There's some bad track coaches out there that it is just go out and turn left, and that's all you do. But if you want to be competitive and good, and if you want your kids to care about it, you have to care about it. So, yeah, I spend a lot of time doing spreadsheets. So actually, one of the things that just finished, we do this whole time trial thing where we have kind of like an intra-squad scrimmage almost. And I have 150 kids doing 16 events, which you can do the math. That's a lot of numbers I have to enter into spreadsheets and send out. And we make a big deal out of it. We order T-shirts for the winning team. I just ordered those tonight. And that's over. So I feel like coaching has just been taking over every aspect of my life that hasn't been dad life, and teaching life has been coaching life, and it hasn't left a lot for writing life.
And those of you that can't see, he's wearing an indoor track
oh yeah
indoor track sweatshirt right now as we speak.
Yes.
It's like it pervades everything.
Most of my wardrobe is just track stuff. So whenever we do the fundraisers, I feel too guilty asking everyone to buy stuff, so I always have to buy something myself.
Buying your own stuff.
Yeah. For the rest, and so this is spring break. Like this, we didn't mention that yet. That's pretty big news. We're 2 teachers on spring break, which the best. But yeah, I'm also, on top of all that other stuff, I'm taking 2 college classes right now to finish my licensure that's due this summer. So I've been slacking on that a little bit. So I'm trying to get them both done by the end of spring break, so I don't have to worry about them the rest of the year. And that's probably going to fill the rest. Now that I'm caught up on teaching and coaching stuff, now I can do all my
Those of you
classes.
that are just joining us, Justin has a master's degree in biomedical engineering, and I have an LEd degree. Justin, according to our brilliant state and national government, has to go back and take more classes so he can teach students.
Yeah.
And I can rest on my laurels.
Yeah.
It just makes absolutely no sense.
It's whatever. But it's stressful, and I guess,
Welcome to education.
I know. I don't want this to turn into just a giant vent sesh for me, but I guess I will say this: I'm in a writing group now, and I'm really involved in that, and it's been really cool. And just talking to those people, so many of us struggle with all of the daily commitments that we all have, and we're all very busy. And it's okay. It's okay. You don't need to feel shame and guilt, during those busy seasons of life. Write when you can. don't beat yourself up if, you're finishing a college class and you don't have time to write every day, You fit it in when you can, try and be
Yep.
consistent, find a process that works for you, but also, it's life and sometimes it's crazy. But speaking of writing, I had a goal to submit something to a press called Ram Eye, or maybe it's a magazine. I'm not super familiar with it, but someone posted it on my writing group, and it was they were looking for
Yeah.
a 3-part horror series totaling 7,000 words. And I have a story called Trapped from way back in the day, which was a ghost story. And I had
Yeah.
written kind of a sequel to it that isn't an obvious sequel, but it is a sequel called The Shadow, which, so Trapped is from the perspective of a ghost. It's a deceased father who has to watch his family kind of move on, and he descends into
Yeah.
this like really bitter existence. And then The Shadow is actually the story of the next family that moves in, but it's from their perspective, and now it's
Yeah.
kind of more of a traditional ghost story. And then I was going to write a third one that was basically kind of concluding that series. The feedback I got on Trapped from the judges was they really wished there was some sort of redemption for the character at the end. Like there was some sort of, it was such a sad and
Mm-hmm.
hopeless ending. So by making it a 3-part series, I was actually going to write basically this kind of jaded priest character who was going to come and perform an exorcism, and he was going to kind of, it was going to end in a positive resolution for the
Right.
character
Right.
from Trapped. And I didn't things are so busy. The deadline was today. I knew when I set this goal that the chances of me actually doing it were 0.001%. But just by thinking about it, and I think this is an important
Right.
part, just by thinking about it, I had this new idea for a new story. I wrote a couple paragraphs as like an intro, kind of outlining this character, and now I have a new story to move forward with, even though I didn't even submit to this thing. Like, just by making myself think about submitting to this thing, I made some progress and have a new seed for a story. So, even if you know that you're really busy and you probably don't have time to finish some of these submissions and contests, just like keeping your head in the game is going to help you to keep moving forward as a writer, I think.
I
Um,
kind of have the same thing. I was kind of frustrated because I kind of stalled on my book. I had an agent, got a huge publisher to look at it. Finally, they passed at the last minute. It's with a couple other agents now. I don't know that's going to go anywhere. I'm not super hopeful, just statistically.
mhm.
Uh, so I just felt stuck. And then I looked back, and just like you said, I looked back and I reread a couple things I'd written over COVID, and just was like, how can I get back into something? I was inspired by you. And then I remember I woke up at like 3:15 in the morning, and I remember I just sat up and I was like, wait a minute. A lot of the stories I wrote could fit together under this one theme. I'm going to have to throw out a couple, but a lot of them will fit.
Mhm.
I wonder if I could put all these together, tweak them a little bit, and kind of come up with something. And I remember I woke up the next day, I was very excited to just get after it a little bit
Yeah.
and say, hey, let's write all these down. I think this might work. And for the first time in a while, I felt really kind of hopeful and excited.
Yeah.
Like, even I'm just going to self-publish this. It'll be self-published. It'll just be a group of stories, essays, humorous essays that are somewhat linked together,
Yeah.
and with a common theme to some degree.
Mhm.
And just, it gives me a goal. It gives me something to work on. It gives me something to make deadlines on. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm totally with you. A lot of commonality there.
Yeah. Another contest that I've marked as a goal that I don't know if I'll get done with. This one isn't due till the end of the month, so I feel like there's a chance. The other one was like a 0.01% chance. This is like a 2% chance, but it's the Flashpoint Speculative Fiction Series contest. They're asking for 3 to 5 flash fiction pieces, flash fiction being 1,000 words or less, that are standalone stories but work together as a series. So
Wow.
submissions are due by March 31st. And I have a flash fiction piece that I've always really liked that a lot of people who read it said, like, oh, I wish I knew more. I wish you would expand this. It's called Safe Passage. I've talked about it on here before.
Yeah, it's really good.
It was my first writing battle submission, and it swept all the way to the final 16, and then in the final 16, I lost by 1 vote to the actual winner. Or the eventual winner. So I've always felt like that was a really strong story that
it is a strong story.
Came close.
It's very, very good.
So I've thought in that story there's kind of 3 character groups that come together. There's the captain of the ship, there's a soldier, and there's this rich family that they're kind of escorting. And so my idea is kind of writing a prequel story for each of those 3 and then kind of wrapping it up in Safe Passage. So that would be 4 stories. And that's I'm thinking about if I could get that done, I'm going to try and submit that to this competition. So it might be kind of fun. I also feel like, it's interesting that these series competitions are what I came across, because that's not really what I write, but might be good for my collection that I'm kind of working on. Even if these stories don't get selected, now I've got kind of some almost episodic pieces that I could put into that collection, which might make it feel more connected, which I'm excited about. The only other thing real quick, before we switch to voice stuff, the writing group I had a speed friending event online this weekend where we got to kind of know each other, and that was fun, and it was inspiring to meet some of the other authors. At one point, I was in a breakout room with 2 lovely ladies from Wales. They were talking to me about writing, and
awesome.
Yeah, it was just really...
They have an accent?
Oh yes, they all.
I love that.
And I'm sure they think I have a
really
crazy,
cool.
weird American accent.
I know, they probably think the same thing about you. We were with this guy. They're probably somewhere in Wales. We were with this guy in American accent.
I know, right? And at one point, I was really disappointed though, because I'm in the room with this person from Wales, and a prompt that comes up is what's your favorite concert you've ever been to? And my favorite band is Muse, which is an English band, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be awesome. They're gonna be like, oh, you're an American and you like Muse, and they'd never heard of Muse. So I was so disappointed. I was like, how? But anyway.
I love you too, so maybe they would have jumped on board on that. I don't know.
There you go. All right, so I think that's a good kind of point to switch to our conversation about voice. And John, I know you ranked voice a little bit higher than I did in our initial rankings. I think our views on voice are a little different. I wouldn't be surprised if today, we kind of come from different places and see. It'll be interesting to see what we agree.
I will even
and disagree.
say, since that episode, I think my views have changed.
Mine has as well. I'll say too, in one of our first episodes, it was like 6 pieces of advice which we knew when we started writing. And one of my pieces of advice was something like, don't worry about what words you're using. Like, tell a good story. And I guess in some ways that's an okay thing to tell like a novice writer. Like, don't overthink your language. Don't try to show off with your language. But pretty much that advice could be interpreted as like voice doesn't matter. And I do wonder if 3 years ago I might have told you voice doesn't matter. And my perspective has definitely changed as well. So I'm sure we've both grown in that time, but I think we still probably have differing opinions to some degree. So it'll be a fun conversation. But why don't you start off the conversation? I know you've done some good research, so go ahead and get us started talking about.
So we're going to kind of break this up into parts. First of all, what is voice? What are we even talking about? In literature, voice refers to the vocabulary, tone, point of view, syntax that makes phrases, sentences, and paragraphs flow in a particular manner. I kind of think of voice as like our actual voices. So if someone calls you on the phone, or in your case, a little kid screams from another room, you might know immediately who that is. Believe it or not, there are writers that are so talented and so on point that you can pick up one of their books without even looking at the cover, open it up and just start reading and be like, I know exactly who this is. And they know exactly who they are from this writing. And that's kind of what we're getting at with voice. Yeah. What do you think? What are your thoughts on what is voice?
Yeah, I got some things that I've written down that I think will kind of help. I think in terms of how we define it, we're actually on a similar wavelength. I kind of wrote out a bunch. I almost think of it, if as like sliders. So like if you think of like settings on a computer program or something, there you set it a certain, maybe you like your brightness here and your volume here, and it's almost
Oh
like
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
your writing, like how do you set your sliders? So
Uh huh.
are you someone who writes very dark tones? Or are you more lighthearted? Are you someone who likes to get very detailed, or do you kind of stay artfully vague?
Right.
What is that balance of dialogue versus prose versus action versus exposition? How much time do you spend describing the senses of a scene, or do you just jump right into the action?
Yeah.
Stephen King versus Neil Gaiman, let's say. I also think voice can be. I think some are more distinct, and I think some are more invisible. Growing, it's funny mentioning this story right now because the my viewpoint of it has kind of changed over the years. But growing up, I loved Harry Potter. Like Harry Potter was the book that made me fall in love with reading. I grew up with Harry
Right.
Potter.
Right. And that's true for so many people.
It is. There's no question. I don't know that J.K. Rowling's voice is very distinct. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you ask me like,
Yeah.
what about J.K. Rowling? It makes her writing good. I don't know that the voice is anything to write home about. She came up with a really good story with really good characters with a magical setting that people fell in love
That's a solid point. It's a solid point. And you wonder how much reading do you have to do before voice really clicks to you?
Right, right.
I do wonder that. I think that there's people who, it's kind of like movies. Like some people just love the art house movie and stuff like that.
Right.
That see movies all the time.
Sure.
But if I'm going to see one movie in a year, just like most people may read one book in a year,
Yeah.
maybe, I'm going to see the new Top Gun.
Right.
I'm going to see the new Marvel movie. That's what I'm going to see. But if you do a huge amount of reading or see a huge amount of movies, all of a sudden you see something there that you didn't see before. Your palette kind of gets refined a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to a point where I think you and I maybe disagree on voice a little bit. I think you see it as like an inherent thing, like you find your voice. I don't know that I see it that way. I think voice is something that you change for the story, and how good are you at. So, for example, Neil Gaiman, I mentioned, I think he has the strongest voice of anyone I read. Like it's great. But even then, like, how his voice is in The Ocean at the End of the Lane is different than how his voice is in Good Omens. It's a different voice. Even though it's his voice and there are similarities, I think the competitions we've been doing, we won't use any specific examples, but some of the best uses of voice in the last writing battle, in my opinion, were written, I mentioned last episode, from the perspective of a child. And they captured the voice of a child very well. Now, does that mean that person writes all of their stories from a child's perspective? I would assume not, right? So I do think there's something. I think there's maybe we're describing two different things. Like there's finding maybe your inherent voice, which I guess is that kind of set of sliders that you're the most strong with. That you kind of. But I also feel like you have to be careful because if you're writing lots of things, you don't want your voice to become too one note, if that makes sense. I feel like you need to be able to change your voice to fit the story you're trying to tell. So, for example, we mentioned point of view as an important piece of voice. My natural favorite point of view to write with is first person. I like writing first person. It brings me right in the action. It brings me in the character's head. I like writing that way. I like first person present. That's like my style of choice. But if I'm writing a story that I know would benefit from being third person, I need to be able to, even though that's not like my natural perspective, I like to write. I need to be, as a talent, I feel like, in my opinion, if you're a talented author, you should be able to tell a story in different ways. I think an interesting exercise would be take a story that you feel strongly about that you've written and write it from a different perspective. How does the story change? How does the voice change? So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? About is voice something inherent, or is it a craft thing that you change as you go?
I think it could go a little bit of both. So a good example I think is you got Mark Twain with dry wit and sarcasm. He writes tales of his life growing up on the Mississippi. Those come through in Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer, but he also wrote a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court with the same voice, but a totally different era.
Sure.
So I guess, I don't know. I might push back on your pushback there a little bit and say, when you find your voice, you find your voice. And I think we'll circle back around to this. Because I have some more notes on this.
Okay.
Let's move on to why does voice matter? Like why should you care? And I think voice matters because it brings characters to life. It lets you know things about the character and the narrator that go beyond the piece, maybe beyond even the dialogue or the text. When we rank our parts of the story, I might now put voice even higher than I did. Because I'll tell you why. Because when I read all these agents listing, the number one thing they're looking for is a fresh voice. And here's the frustrating thing is they won't define it. No one will define it.
Right.
They just are like, I know when I see it. I know when I want to find it. I will say, reading through all the different stories we did on Writing Battle, fresh voice really popped for me, even more than character context. A lot of times, I was really drawn to a strong voice, and I think it's really what sets works and writers apart. So if you say, "Hey, I have awesome characters, I have an awesome story, I have this plot, it's got this cool everything, but I don't have a fresh voice," I think if you are saying, I'm going to be traditionally published and you send this out to agents, it's going to fall flat. Versus you could say, I have an okay story. I have an okay character. I have an okay twist, but I have a fresh voice that is going to just pop to you. I think they asked for that manuscript, and I don't think they asked for the other one.
Yeah. I agree. Especially in those competitions, you can tell the difference between, I hate using the word like good and, I don't want to, but you can spot someone who has a more well-developed voice than someone who doesn't, and it does make a world of difference. I would guess most of the time in the duels I voted for, it's probably fair to say that the winner very frequently just had a stronger writing voice. But again, like you mentioned, like voice is such a vague thing, and how do we define it?
It is. And I love how no one will define it. Right. No one will say what they're looking for. And if you go to agent after agent, editor after editor, they will just, on every page, they'll be like, I'm looking for a fresh voice, a new voice. And they will not define that. Even if you go deep and you're like, I'm going to go find this person showed interest in my work, so I'm going to go find interviews with them. They will never define it. They'll just be like, well, right. I know it when I see it.
Sure. Yeah, and I think...
as a writer, it's super frustrating.
Yeah, and I think what you hit on there, you started talking about characters, and that was what we both ranked first. And I think voice is tied to that.
I think you're right.
That's part of...
That's a solid point.
I think that's part of what I'm getting at too. So if you look at the different point of views, right? You could do first person. So if you're doing first person, your writing voice is directly coming from the character. Like it's you speak like your character speaks. Now I think the reason why you especially like associate that as like your voice is your character in your stories is you. Right. So like, that's your voice. So it's this inherent thing. But for someone who writes fiction, if, I'm going to try and use some examples, in my, kind of novel manuscript, my main character's guy in his early 20s. Right. But, in the short story I just wrote for NYC Midnight, The main character, another first-person story, was an elderly woman who works at MIT. And the way that I express those two voices needs to be different. Like, if both of those are just me, that's not good. Like, that means I'm a one-note writer who can't change to his characters. Like, I can't capture a character's voice if I can only write as myself, right? So part of it is, like, almost like acting. Like, can you method act, almost, and, like, can you take on the persona of your character and write like your character would talk or speak or think or whatever? Sorry, were you gonna say something?
There's value. I think there's value in that. But as I look over the breadth of writers who broke out, okay,
Sure,
they broke out. They wrote other things or thought other things, and they broke out. Their voice was partially them. Okay, so you look at Hemingway. He's in World War I. Okay, he's an ambulance driver, gets injured. He falls in love with the older nurse. He writes a book called Farewell to Arms. It's about an ambulance driver who gets hurt, who falls in love with the older nurse.
sure.
Okay. Harper Lee, she has this super strong Southern voice in To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's her. It is her. And she even admits it's her. And not only that, she had a neighbor who went on to become a super famous writer by the name of Truman Capote.
Mm-hmm.
He is Dill in, and she even admits it. She's
right.
Truman Capote's voice, that is Dill.
Yeah.
Dill, so I think if you're just starting out, finding your voice as you is important.
Yeah, I don't know.
We can agree to disagree.
Yeah, we might agree to disagree on some of that because I think I don't think we're completely at opposite ends of the spectrum. I agree with, like, I think it's almost like a self-awareness type deal.
Yeah.
Like, you need to know what your strengths are as a writer. I'm an emotional writer. I'm a dramatic writer. I like writing serious stuff. So,
Right.
you know, if I'm sitting down to write, I'm gonna try to play to those strengths, right? Now, what's nice, some of those competitions I do, I'll get assigned rom-com, and it forces me out of my comfort zone, and I kind of, you know, work on those areas that I'm not as strong. But I do think, I don't know, I would say, like, the best writers I know are able to write with different voices.
Yeah.
You know, but to your point, if I read their work, I can still tell it's theirs. Like, there's some patterns that kind of persist through the different versions of their voice. You know, and getting to your point, like, another example would be George R. R. Martin in the Song of Ice and Fire. You know, he's quoted as saying, you know, he's been asked, you know, which of those characters is you? And he says, well, they're all me. Like, they all come from me. But the way he writes Tyrion is different than the way he writes Sam is different than the way he writes Jon Snow. You know, he's able to change the voice. If all of those chapters read with the same voice, I don't think the book would work, right?
I think you make a solid point. And I think all writers, maybe there's some character they relate with best.
Sure.
I'm reminded of when the guy who played George on Seinfeld.
Yeah.
He just, the first whole couple episodes, he's like, I can't figure this character out. And he went into Larry David's office and said, you've written this crazy script where a guy quits his job and he goes back the next day like he didn't quit his job. This would never happen in the real life. And Larry David's like, I totally quit Saturday Night Live and went back the next day like nothing happened. And then all of a sudden, Jason Alexander realizes, oh, in the Seinfeld 4 main characters, I'm playing George, and George is Larry David.
Right.
Now I get it. Now he totally wrote and helped write Kramer, who was his neighbor in real life. And he wrote Elaine and he wrote these other characters. But once he understood, oh, I'm Larry David. Larry David, the George character is him.
Right.
And then he said, oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
Now I get it.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a very interesting story about kind of how to find that voice. A good example. Let's talk about some examples. What are some examples of voice? Maybe you wrote down some. I have a few written down.
Sure.
That I thought of.
Yeah. So one, when I think, and I'm sure you probably have this one written down as well. When I think of an example of classic literature that just screams voice, it's Catcher in the Rye. That,
I wrote that.
Yeah, that story pretty much revolves around the character's voice. I can barely remember the plot of Catcher in the Rye. I just remember a really angsty dude. So,
but J.D. Salinger catches that teenage voice almost perfectly.
Sure.
Here's an interesting question: is he publishes 0 books after that?
All right.
0. Is he stuck in that voice and realizes, I don't have any other voices?
Well,
I got a funny teen and angsty teen.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to have to read this in high school for the next 50 years, and 60 years.
It's actually really funny you bring that up, because that was kind of the point I was about to make in our last part of the conversation. And it applies to this specific example. If every character I ever write is overly logical, middle-aged white guy who teaches,
right.
That's gonna
just like if he couldn't put Holden Caulfield in every single
right. And actually, Holden Caulfield. It's funny because when I started writing Awakening, my main character was very Holden Caulfield-ish. He was a very angsty.
No, I relate to that. 100.
Yeah, and a lot of people hated the character, and I changed it. But my voice has grown a lot since then, and I've realized how to make a character more likable and that kind of stuff. But yeah, so that was a funny example. We talked about several of the people I have listed already. I just listed some of my favorite books. Andy Weir, The Martian. The style kind of played into the voice because he did these journal entries.
Yes.
It kind of made the voice inherently very scientific and logical. So the style he used kind of helped to implement the voice of a scientist, or a botanist, I should say. But then in some of the characters, or in some of the chapters, he goes back to Earth, and he goes to more of a third-person, more traditional perspective, and the voice changes, right? So I do think that's kind of my point of being able to change your voice is a skill, and I think it's an important skill. What's another example you had?
Ernest Hemingway. He was brought up a newspaper guy. And they were forever cutting his stuff to where, okay, this has to be super short because it's in a newspaper. You have limited words, you have title. So famous Ernest Hemingway sentence would be like, he died, period. In the pouring rain, period. Where maybe Melville or Conrad would spend pages describing this death. That would be him. Interesting things. I actually went with my wife to Key West once on a cruise. We went to Hemingway's house. And 2 stories, one that goes with voice. So he had just gone touring. He was forever running low on money. So he's running low on money. He toured everywhere, and this was like his 3rd wife. And he comes home, and Key West is just backwater at that time. And she had put in a saltwater swimming pool at a great cost. So he comes home, and he's so mad because basically she had spent all of his money he had spent touring on his pool.
Yeah.
And he takes his penny out of his pocket, and he's like, why don't you just take my last penny? And he just throws it into the wet concrete. So if you go tour there,
nice.
The penny is still in the concrete of the swimming pool from the story. But dealing with voice, he dealt with depression, and it was really, really bad. It was super painful for him. And it was so painful that he got shock therapy, which is where they put things on his temples, and he got shock therapy. And during the tour, at the end, they're like, hey, do you have any questions? And Hemingway famously committed suicide. And someone said, hey, why do you think, as a tour guide, he was an older guy, you've been doing this forever, why do you think he committed suicide? And he said he got this shock therapy, and rumor has it that he would sit down and write things, and it wouldn't be in his voice anymore. And he would read it, and it didn't sound like him, and it didn't look like him anymore. And it just made him even more depressed.
Right.
Because this was the one thing he had, was he had this Hemingway voice that everyone would know forever, and he no longer had it. And another one that comes to mind, Edgar Allan Poe, dark and gothic. I've read some of his short stories. Really, really, you could almost see where he was a depressive, dark and gothic guy that went with this story.
Yeah.
So,
I talk about Neil Gaiman in my notes, and I've mentioned him. This beautiful, almost like whimsical writing, but it's still just so like efficiently crafted that it never feels dry. What's interesting about him is, he writes children's books, but he also writes, really serious adult books. Some of his short stories.
He really has a breadth of work.
Yes. So it's interesting though to read, like, even in his adult books, there's almost like a childlike magic to it, which I think makes it very unique sometimes. But yeah, it's also interesting with voice. He narrates a lot of his own audiobooks, and I've listened to a lot of them, and it wouldn't feel right to hear some of those books without him narrating it, which I think speaks to his voice. I wrote down Stephen King. He's fast-paced action, some humor and cultural references mixed in, supernatural mixed with realism. I think that's another thing with voice. Do you go for something that's culturally relevant, or are you trying to write something more timeless? I think that's kind of one of those sliders. Where do you fall on that spectrum? I wrote about J.R.R. Tolkien, very detailed, lots of description. You have ancestry and history, yet it's beautiful descriptions of forests and mountains as well.
Even whole other languages.
Yeah. It's
famously he would
to
write things in Elfin that no one else could read because he had made up his own language.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine. The amount of work that just probably like 1% of his work actually ended up on a page.
That
somewhere.
Quote from him where his editor had sent something back and said, "Stop calling them something." He used some word and he said, "That's not a word." And he replied to the editor and said, "Don't tell me what's a word. I wrote the English Oxford Dictionary.
Yeah.
Stop correcting me."
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. I mentioned her already. I mentioned how J.K. Rowling to me is kind of a typical children's story narrator for most of it. But something about that makes it feel oddly comforting and approachable, maybe you could say.
Yeah.
But she kind of blends into the background. Obviously, the perspective follows Harry very closely, gets in his head.
It may have led to a wide appeal, too.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said about that. Like, if you're writing, how... some really skilled writers that write beautiful stuff, it's not super approachable, right? Whereas a Dan Brown, very approachable writing. But again, he's another one where I wouldn't say his voice necessarily stands out and makes the piece.
But on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who study literature that say James Joyce just is a killer to try to read. They're like, this is just hard.
Right. So,
not enjoyable.
Yeah. So those were some of the examples I had written down. Cool. Any more?
What are some tips or ideas we have how you could develop your voice? How could you're a writer out there, you're just trying to go for it. How do you develop that? How do you fall into that voice that is yours?
Yeah, I mean, if we really believe it's something inherent, it's already in there. It's just kind of practicing it. For me, what helped develop my voice more was doing all these competitions.
Right.
Multi-genre prompted, by forcing me to get out of my comfort zone. We talked about how voice is kind of on some level just self-awareness of what your strengths are. I have a better feeling for like what my best writing looks like and what things I should strive for. And you can start to set up your stories for that. If you write really well, first person stuff, you're going to want to write action packed stuff and deep thinking stuff. You want to have characters with really interesting interpersonal dilemmas that they're debating in their head. You want to play to your strengths a little bit. So I think part of finding your voice is finding your strengths, and in order to find your strengths, you got to find your weaknesses. So I think kind of getting out of your comfort zone and trying and failing, and the same stuff with any skill. The more you try it.
Yeah, I kind of have the same thing. I wrote, you got to write a lot. And you're going to have to realize you're going to have to write a lot of unpublishable material.
Right.
To find that voice. And that's not a fun endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to be careful of imitating others, and it can be really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I remember early on, I read a lot of James Patterson, and then I was like, oh, I'm going to write like James Patterson. And I wrote a whole book like James Patterson, and it was horrible.
Right.
And then I read these historical novels like Memoirs of a Geisha and Cold Mountain, and I was like, I'm going to write one of those. And I totally wrote one of those, and it was horrible. So I think it just takes a long time to kind of find your voice and who you are. A great story that I read about is, Lenny Kravitz was trying to become a singer and a musician, and he had an African-American mother. He has a Jewish father, and he decides to make it, I've got to be someone different. So he came out with a whole album, and he was named Romeo Blue. That was his name. And the album came out, Romeo Blue, and it flopped. And he called up his mom and said, you know what? I'm going to be Lenny Kravitz. That's who I'm going to be. I'm going to be Lenny Kravitz. And his next album just was awesome. Awesome. And because he was him. And I kind of went through that a little bit. And I tried to write like other people. And finally, I read some Bill Bryson, some David Sedaris, and I said, I really connect with these people, but I was leery of trying to write again like someone else. Mm-hmm. I was very lucky. I had a writing teacher once in a free writing group. It's totally free, and here in Columbus at the and the teacher had been a former editor and agent, and I was again writing these serious essays and these serious stories. And I wrote one humorous essay, and she pulled me aside and said, hey, just so you know, that was really good. And not everyone can do that. So I would say if you have some people that you really value and you can show them your writing, maybe they can point something out and you can be open to accepting that. I did not want to hear from her, remember I gave you that novel I gave you and you thought that was not that great, but that short story that I wrote that was a humorous essay you thought was awesome. That's not what I wanted to hear at that time, but it was the truth. And she was like, hey, this is what you're really good at. And that's when I kind of turned to writing a little bit differently. One exercise I read about that was very interesting. It said, describe yourself in 3 adjectives. For example, you might write, hey, I'm funny, I'm smart, I'm depressive. Your writing may reflect those 3 things of you. That may be helpful. Another thing I really like is cultural influences, and maybe you could speak to this. I know My Chemical Romance was kind of a big influence on you early on. I know I've had some other influences. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say, cultural. Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on the person. I think some people it'll be a bigger influence than others. I actually, in my writing, I tend to try and avoid too many cultural references or anything like that, which is funny because I know like that's where a lot of your humor comes from. Like that's a pivotal part of your writing. For me, it and I don't know if this is obviously it's silly. No one's going to be reading what I wrote in 50 years or anything like that. But like to me, it dates it. And I don't want it to be dated. I want it in theory, like someone could read this at any time from anywhere and not have to understand that cultural reference. So, to me, I usually try to avoid it unless it's something that just really feels like it needs to be done. But I wouldn't say that's a major part of my voice.
You think it's inspired your voice though? Do you think you've listened to things and read things? And all
Oh,
of a
I'm
sudden been
sure.
like,
Actually, it's fun. I mean, it's got to, right? It's got to. We
right.
in the Zoom thing I did with my writing group this weekend. There was an interesting kind of conversation we had. Someone had heard, um, take your 5 favorite movies of all time and
Uh-huh.
try to find a common thread between those 5 movies. Like, what about
Oh,
those things, draws you? And try writing stories in that thread. Like if you're looking for a place to start writing.
hey, that's kind of cool. I
Yeah.
like that.
So for me, there's no doubt. I mean, we've talked about it before. Awakening was very much inspired by Inception. Like,
Yeah.
I was so into that. I got so obsessed with Inception and lucid dreaming and all that stuff, and I kind of invented this entirely new like science fiction story that was based on that concept. And another one of my favorite movies growing up was The Matrix. Well, what do Inception and The Matrix have in common? What is real? Like, how do you tell if you're dreaming? Like, that is
Yeah.
literally
Yeah.
like the central
Yeah.
question in both those movies. It's 2 of my favorite movies of all time. So a lot of and it's funny now, even now, the stories I write often have this like, what is real element to them, or who am I? In a story I wrote that I really liked recently called "Help with Remembering," the main character couldn't remember who he was. You could obviously draw parallels between that and Memento, which is another Christopher Nolan movie. So I definitely think we're all inspired by the stories we already know. I don't know how deep into the psychology you want to go of is any invention truly a work of creative,
Right. Right. Can you
I,
just trace things back? Or
yes, yes. So I think we're all influenced by the stories we've heard. So yeah, I think probably another piece of advice for developing your voice is, experience more stories, find what you like. I wrote down in my notes,
yeah.
read distinctive voices. Try to read
Yeah.
people who
Absolutely.
and what makes their voice good. I've definitely been inspired by some of my I'll call them author role models in the competitions I do. I want to write more like them, in my voice, sure, but I want to develop it in the way they've developed theirs.
Right.
I want
Absolutely.
my prose to be as beautiful as theirs, or my stories to be as creative as theirs, or my characters to be as unique as theirs. And I definitely think, just like anything, you can be inspired by other people in the community. And yeah, I think I've grown as an author and grown my voice more by experiencing other people's.
I feel like I've written enough now that I can fall into my voice where pretty easily, pretty quickly, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where and maybe there's some kind of running analogy here where you can fall into your pace or
Sure.
something like that pretty quickly, where I know it took a lot of work for me to find that earlier,
Mm-hmm.
where I would spend a long time and delete whole pages and be like, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. Where now I can just kind of fall into, oh, I'm writing as me now.
Yeah.
And just in that writing battle competition, very quickly it became my voice
Mm-hmm.
and my story. And if you read any of my other work, you'd be like, oh, this is totally the same voice that he writes these other things in. Even though this is fiction and the other ones are not fiction, it's still the same voice. It's still the same voice. And I fell into that pretty quickly. So I will say, if you're a beginning writer and you're frustrated with this, it comes to you. It does. And I remember as a basketball player, I used to shoot the ball with 2 hands, and it was very ineffective.
Yeah.
And I spent just huge number of hours in my backyard practicing form over
Mm-hmm.
and over and over and over and over and over again for just hours and hours. And here I am, almost 50 years old. If you pass me a basketball, I can shoot it properly real quick.
Right.
Real quick.
Right.
And I've learned how to do that. And it's just a muscle memory. And I
Mm-hmm.
think you can do that with your voice. I think you can find your voice and you can fall into that writing voice pretty quickly just by muscle memory of, I've done this enough. I know where I'm going.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, um, to a very young writer, very novice writer, I wouldn't even spend much time thinking about it. I would just write, and you'll find it. Don't overthink what your voice is, because you're not going to find it right away. I believe, and this might be another thing we disagree on. I think your voice can change over time, and I think I still am, even after this discussion. I think there's some overlap in what we think, but I still think that crafting a voice is important. I do think there are inherent strengths, inherent trends, inherent patterns that makes you you. I suppose if you become, and maybe this is one of the disconnects, like if you become a published author, if you become a Neil Gaiman or a traditionally published, and that agent wants to market you as you, right? Then there's this expectation of you need to write in a similar way,
right?
And so then you kind of have a brand. As you're up and coming, I don't think you're restricted by that as much.
I think that's a solid point. Like
yeah.
if Lenny Kravitz comes out with a jazz album,
right,
people might be like, that's not what I was hoping for.
Right. But then you have
But I think sometimes people get frustrated because they get kind of pigeonholed as that,
Right. Well,
and I think of Stephen King, everyone's
right.
like, oh, you're a horror author, without realizing he has some of the best short stories that have nothing to do with horror.
Right.
Out there.
Yeah. And I think, a criticism that could happen to musical artists that makes kind of the same stuff every time is, well, you don't experiment or branch out. You just keep making the same album over and over.
Right.
Again, right. So yeah, I do think that's something that, but it is interesting. I was in one of the people in my group, and I don't know all of them very well yet. I'm very new, but my understanding is she's recently reached the New York Times best-selling list. So she's like legit. And we were kind of joking about a potential thing, and she said, "Well, I can't do that. That's off-brand for me." And it's like that's something that I wouldn't even meant in my head. But again, once you've established yourself as something, then maybe the voice becomes a bigger deal. But
that's a good point. That's a good point. I didn't really think about that.
Yeah, if you're just writing for fun or you're doing a bunch of competitions, then I think you can try
play
new
with
voices
it and do whatever you want.
Yeah. And I think being able to change your voice when necessary to capture a character, to tell a story in a certain way, I do think that's a skill worth developing. I definitely would say that. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's a pretty good kind of place to wrap up. Any other kind of closing thoughts on voice?
No, I think we hit it pretty well. I think you do have to think about, what is my voice going to be? Will I be stuck with that voice? That's good. I've got a little bit to think about here. I wrote down some good notes. I really like that. Choose 5 movies and 5 themes.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah. I think
I'm gonna do that. I wrote that down.
Cool. I
really like that.
Well, I do want to do kind of some community shout-outs here. We got a lot of messages this week, so I just picked a few that I thought would be good to share. So here are some whippersnappers. One message came from Corey. This was on Instagram. She said, "Today my story was knocked out by another." Talking about writing battle here. "But it was also given a shout-out on this podcast. And that sure helped take the sting off the day. It was a really cool experience for me to hear 2 people that I don't know discussing my work like I am a real writer or something. So thanks for that." Well, hey, Corey, awesome. You are definitely a real writer, and we're glad you listened. All right, the next one comes from Shannon, and this was actually a message on the NYC Midnight forums. Is where she founded me. She said, "I wanted to thank you and John profusely for all that you have done to inspire writers in the past few weeks, including myself. I fell into your podcast when it was mentioned on the forums, and I have listened to the first 3 episodes thus far. I was floored and so honored to be included in a shout-out by John in your Whippy Awards episode." All right, and I'm going to kind of skip towards a long message. Um, she said, I personally thank you from the bottom of my heart because what you set out to do landed with me. It was all in a fun, humorous, and delightful addition to the comp, and I will underscore John's sentiment on the forum. Yes, y'all's enthusiasm for our stories has fueled my soul and has made an impact. I am new at creative writing, and I know I have a long way to go and a lot to learn. The invaluable lessons from NYC Midnight and Writing Battle are sparkly gems to new writers as myself and gleam brighter when fun is infused along the way. Keep up the good work. You both have made a difference in our community, and I thank you. Consider me an official Wipper Snapper. So that was
nice.
Cool. Yes, and then one more here. This comes from Ryan. Ryan sent us an email, and this is maybe a good kind of transition into future plans. He says, "Hello, John and Justin. Really enjoying the podcast. Absolutely loved the reveal episode with the writing battle prompts, especially the psychology on how and what to write for the competition. Also, thank you both for my feedback on my story, The Lost Temple of Osiris. I enjoyed that one. Thanks for sharing, Ryan." He says, "I'm sure that you guys have received a ton of offers to be guests on the podcast and would love to throw my name in the hat and offer another competition. The Writer's Playground does a 10-day, 3,000-word challenge a couple times a year. Everyone is given 5 characters and 5 locations to choose from, and everyone is given 1 object they must use. In some ways, I like this more than NYC Midnight competition. Additionally, the feedback from the judges is very thorough and more precise than NYC. I have competed twice, and each time their assessment of my story has been spot on, even when I placed in the year anniversary challenge." I think Ryan's actually being a little bit modest there. I think he actually won that one if I saw the results, right? He said, "If you want to compare the feedback on either of my stories, I can send that as well. Also, it's decently priced. Something to look and see if you guys are interested." So, Ryan, I think we'll probably be in touch. That sounds really cool. I'm down to give Writer's Playground a try.
Yeah.
John, you up for another
Absolutely I am.
fictional competition? So Ryan, if you're listening, I think we are going to take you up on your offer, so we'll be in touch sometime soon, and maybe we can have you on whenever Writers Playground releases their prompts, and you can kind of share some of your experience and expertise, and we can talk about it. Because John and I will both be rookies at that one. Neither of us have done Writers Playground before. So, all right. So thank you to all you whippersnappers. And if you are listening today and would like to join in on the conversation, maybe you think we really missed the boat on voice and there was some key, gem of information that would really help drive the points home. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Part of the reason we made this podcast was to connect with other authors, and it's really exciting that it looks like maybe that's finally starting to happen after 3 years of just speaking into the void. So, please reach out. We're on, you can get us our emails, writinginprogresspod@gmail.com. We are on Instagram at writinginprogresspod. We are on Twitter, if you can find us through the filters, at Writing in Pod, and we are on Facebook just simply as Writing in Progress. I think we are going to be joining YouTube and TikTok as well soon. We've been experimenting with recording some video of our episodes while we talk, so we might be putting up some video clips at some point as well. So I'll keep you guys updated with that. John, anything you'd like to add before we kind of sign off for the night?
Well, as always, hi, Mom. And we've increased our listeners exponentially, so hope everything's, going great. And
it was interesting too. I'm probably going to post a post about this. We have a lot of international listeners. We had quite a few from outside the U.S., which is definitely interesting.
So awesome.
Yeah. So
really cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, what time is it now? It's 11:18 on a Monday night. Normally, we would both be fast asleep. And actually,
Not tonight.
I
Spring
have,
break, baby.
it's spring break, but I have practice from 8:30 to noon, so I probably should go to bed.
And I do not.
Spring break for a track coach, not quite as freeing, but I don't know. Maybe going to track practice is a little less stressful than staying home with the kids. So maybe I'm still making out all right. So. All right. Thank you for listening. Please reach out to us. We're going to try and be more consistent with our episodes here. Just like with writing or running or anything else, the more consistent we can be, the better. And we're doing a good job so far this year. So hopefully we can keep it going. So
Be on it.
all right. Thanks for listening and stay in progress.